can't be trusted to describe the problem, why should we trust you to fix the problem? It's wholly acceptable.
But they've had a 19% pay cut in 13 years. That's completely ridiculous. It's only Brexit. It's all she cares about. It's like, oh, now Brexit's happened, suddenly they're now extreme. But apparently, the merciless slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people is in no way extreme. There's all the stuff that she voted for and campaigned for nonetheless.
Welcome to Question Time. This is our first of 2023. Welcome to our panellists. Welcome to all of you here in Birmingham. Great to see you. And, of course, welcome to you at home. We'll have a lively debate here. Of course, there's a lively debate on social media as well. So do join in. The address will be on the screen. You can take part in the conversation that way. Enjoy the programme. Let's have our first question tonight, which is from Navreen Fagura.
With a record 50,000 patients a week experiencing over 12-hour A&E waits, when will the Prime Minister finally admit the NHS is in crisis?
So, Navreen, you're asking this question. What is your experience with the NHS? Why are you asking it?
Well, I'm a junior doctor, so I'm working in the NHS. I worked on the front line, and you just see the problems. Patients can't move from A&E into beds on the wards. Patients are just there, especially elderly patients who need social care. They just can't be discharged. They're there for days and if not weeks. And you've just got really sick patients in ambulances that just can't move through the system. And just like recently, my own nan spent 48 hours in a trolley in ED before she could move to a ward. So I experienced it through work and through my own family. And it's just in crisis. And I just think there's been like a decade of underfunding and a workforce crisis that has not been addressed. And this is why, I think the NHS is pretty much at breaking point.
So, Alex, Navreen is a junior doctor, is using the word crisis. The Prime Minister conspicuously is not using the word crisis. Yeah. Is he wrong to do so?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister is absolutely clear, and he said this, that the NHS is under extreme pressure, and he's not balked about that at all.
But why would the word crisis is many people have asked him to try and get him to say it. He's not saying. Is that because he doesn't think it is?
No, look, I think he recognises this is immensely serious, and certainly when he did his speech recently at the beginning of the year, he named getting down the waiting list as one of his absolute priorities. And of course, last weekend, as you know, he was there meeting with the NHS. The pressures are absolutely extraordinary. I think we know that. But what he's been absolutely clear about as one of his targets, he wants to get the waiting list down to, they were at 2 years, not least because of the backlog from COVID, get them under 2 years to 18 months maximum by this spring, and then by next spring down to 12 months. And what he said, and I think this is really refreshing, is he said, look, here I stand, this is the target, this is what I want to be judged on, and if I don't, you please do judge me. And I think that's absolutely the right approach. So he's been clear, yes, this is an intense issue, but he's got a plan to deal with it.
Okay. Navreen, you asked a question. Does it matter to you whether or not the Prime Minister uses the word crisis or not?
I think it does, because if you acknowledge there's a crisis, then you know there's a problem to fix. But when you're not just skirting around...
We're literally in a Callaghan moment here, where there is a crisis and the Prime Minister just literally refuses to admit that there is one.
...issue, you don't really do anything properly to change it. And by just saying we're investing loads of money this year, if you look, the own Department of Health funded a report which showed, by the King's Health Fund, which showed there's been a decade of underfunding and not addressing the issues, which is why we're in this problem. It's not just the COVID backlog, it's been going on for years, and we don't have the staff or the beds or the facilities to actually fix this. What Rishi Sunak says just will not happen. We just don't have the staff or the beds. And there's no point saying we've got loads of new people coming in if the current nurses and doctors are leaving. And we have the lowest number of doctors per thousand in the population for OECD countries. So there is just a problem that they're just not addressing properly.
Well, certainly demand is colossal, and it's not just because of the pandemic, although the pandemic did have a very significant impact, not least because people weren't being referred, people got sicker because elective care didn't happen, which is why he wants to continue with elective care. But on the specific capacity, since 2010, there are 34,000 more doctors and 44,000 more nurses. Now, I absolutely accept that we need to go further, and he is going further, and indeed, I think since 20...
When they say those numbers, I never really know whether they are saying specifically how many, if that's how many they've recruited, or is that how many have increased since previous, right? Because I would not put it past the Tories at this point to only say the numbers they've recruited whilst neglecting to tell people what their actual attrition levels are, right? Because they can say we've hired X many new doctors, but if X many plus one have left, then it's still negative, right? Yeah, I'm not doing too bad, Morton. Actually, I had a pretty easy day today at work, so only got a 3-day week this week, so fingers crossed after tomorrow we'll have another period of not having much work to do.
19, I think there have been an additional 4,000 doctors, and there are 72,000 nurses and midwives currently being trained. But what we have got to do is to ensure that we don't make, as it were, don't make the mistakes of simply saying, right, we're just going to focus on urgent and emergency care. We've got to get through that elective care, because if we don't, those people will become sicker. And that's what, last thing is that I know you say it's not all about money, but even at a time like this when finances are stretched, he found an additional £14 billion to ensure that the NHS has got really resources going into the coming years.
Anna, just say, obviously, because you were a former government...
It's also worth pointing out, though, that the extra money they've put into the NHS is at the expense of them forecasting doing big budget cuts for 2024 and 2025. Mostly, actually, it was 2025 and 2026, right? They budgeted for 2023 and for 24 as having budget increases and then doing massive cuts coming into 25 and 26 on the knowledge that they're not going to be in government then. So any additional debt that they rack up now is going to be blamed, is going to mean that cuts going to be blamed on the incoming government, which almost certainly will not be the Conservatives come 2025. So for them to say, "Oh, we're funding it loads," but that's when you look at the future budget projections, that's on the promise of cuts later. I appreciate that, Martin. Yeah, there are very few UK streamers, at least not UK streamers that kind of exclusively cover UK politics as well.
Public health.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you convinced by that? You're shaking your head.
How the hell can we sort this problem out in an honest and effective way if we can't even admit that there is a crisis, and it's the biggest crisis in the NHS's history? And until we have a government that actually accepts that, we're not going to make progress. Look, there are certain things that this government should be doing absolutely now. The first thing is to sort out the nurses' pay claim, the other pay claims, and it's up to the government to do it, and it can do it, and it should do it. You're a junior doctor. I'm a trustee of a little charity called Doctors in Distress. And we know, as you know, the reality, lots of you know, the reality of what's happening in our NHS. We have people on the front line who go into medicine because they care passionately to help people get better, or if they can't make them better, to ease their pain and discomfort. These people are burnt out, they are at their wits' end, and they are leaving because they are racked with guilt and shame that they can't deliver the service that they want to deliver and we expect. So sort out the staffing. Increase the morale, therefore, of our workforce and let them get on and treat patients. Let's bring back all those EU workers and fill some of the gaps in our staffing level. And one in 8...
We don't necessarily need to get EU workers in, right? There are plenty of people who can come and work in the NHS from overseas who are not members of the EU. I mean, it'd be nice, right? But it's typical Anna Soubry, right, at this point to go, I know there's this massive crisis, but have we thought about Brexit? Considering the position that she's in, considering the position where that she was a member of the Conservative Party up until 2019, right? All of those 9 years where the Conservatives were in power, engaging in their ideological reign of terror, literally hacking up the public sector, including the NHS. Let's not forget the Lansley reforms, which are the root cause of a huge amount of the parts of the crisis we're seeing in the NHS, where, you know, where patients get passed around from trust to trust because it's an absolute mess because the reforms were terrible. She voted that shit through. The fact that our public health in general is really bad because of other public sector cuts, because of all of the different things where people's wages have stagnated, and that's led to more ill health because people are finding it harder to be able to provide themselves the necessities in life. That's all her fault too, because she voted all that shit through, because, you know, all those hundreds of thousands of people that died because of austerity, she is also to blame for that too, because she voted through all the austerity policies, right? And the only thing that made her move away from the Conservative Party that she was a part of, or that she rubber stamped all of the shit that they did, all of the grotesque policy that they engaged in up until 2019, right? Up until that point, she was on board with everything they did. She only moved to Change UK because of Brexit. That's it. That's all these people. And actually, she is the absolute pinnacle of liberalism, right? She's the absolute pinnacle of the liberal mindset over the past 13 years, right? Remember how I always talk about the time how liberals were just absolutely fine with the austerity policies from 2010 to 2015? Because obviously David Cameron's, his share of the vote went up and his number of seats went up and he got an overall majority, right? Their reign of terror where hundreds of thousands of people died, liberals were like, oh, well, my mortgage hasn't gone up. I haven't noticed the public services have been worse because I don't rely on them because I'm a middle-class liberal type, right? And they're the exactly kind of people who have these opinions who say the turning point has to have been Brexit rather than the absolute fucking charlatan government that we had between 2010 and 2016. And it's typical that she's now going, oh, isn't it terrible how Boris Johnson's a liar and how the NHS is in crisis now? It's like, this is your fault. This is the party that you're a part of for all of that time. It's exactly their fault. You are 100% as much to blame as anybody else for this, Anna. Just because you decided that you wanted to break ranks over Brexit, which in the long scheme of things is nowhere near as much of a problem as the economic mismanagement of this country for the past 43 years, let's be real. It's ever since the dawn of neoliberalism, or 44 years now. It's ever since the dawn of neoliberalism that we have had a poorly managed economy in this country. And you're part of that. You're part of that for everything up until the last 4 years. I'm sorry. Brexit's not great. I don't think Brexit's a good thing. You can't blame it for everything, and you cannot use it as a way of deflecting from your failures in government, Anna. And Liberals can't do that to make it as as rejoining the EU as some kind of panacea for this country's problems, because it really isn't, right? I bet you there are plenty of FBPE types, especially people who are fans of Anna Soubry, who think that once Keir Starmer comes in and implements neoliberalism but just more competently, that things are going to suddenly start to get better. Well, I promise you they fucking won't. They just will not. That's just not true. There needs to be proper reversing of course on the current direction this country is going. And managerial neoliberalism is not going to cut the mustard. And I'm pretty sure that's what Anna Soubry wants, right? If she didn't genuinely believe in neoliberalism as a policy perspective, she wouldn't have been a member of the Conservative Party, and she would have broken ranks before Brexit. It's as simple as that. Unless she's had some kind of huge change of heart on her overall internal politics, I don't see that as being the case anywhere else.
Posts is unfilled. It's a crisis. And the third thing which this government must do is make now the changes to social care. 1 in 8 beds is blocked by somebody who can't go into a care home. And Alex, I was in a government that knocked it into the long grass. Other subsequent governments has done it. Your government is now doing it again, and it's not good enough. If it means I have to pay more tax, I'll pay more tax to give us an NHS which is doing the job we all want it to do.
There are a lot of hands up.
I don't even think that she even needs to pay any more tax. I don't think she's on 100k, right, or even 80k as a barrister. I mean, I guess it depends on how many kind of political donations that she gets for being, like a high-profile ex-politician / trustee. But I'm pretty sure that she's not part of the huge people who are raking in huge amounts of wealth that really need taxing. What we really need is wealth taxes, right? Wealth tax is what we actually need, as Richard Burgon was pointing out Politics Live all those months ago, right? Wealth taxes and equalising things like dividend payouts and things like capital gains tax, all that kind of stuff. That's what we really, really need. But even then, we can just fund the NHS properly because we are a currency issuer with a central bank.
The lady there in the yellow dress, I saw that you were nodding along to that.
I'm also a junior doctor,
right.
and I live and work in Anna's old constituency. And I work on a dementia specialist ward, and I've had patients who are medically fit, who do not need to be in an acute hospital bed, waiting for placements for months now, because there's 165,000 vacancies in social care, and you haven't addressed it. Last year, 7,000 doctors approached our regulator looking for a permission and their paperwork to go and work abroad. You only train 8,000 medical students a year. Retention is in crisis in the NHS. You must address it. You must address it. And my trust declared a critical incident, and it stepped down the critical incident, not because things are getting better, but because it doesn't make any difference us declaring a critical incident, because you refuse to accept that this is a crisis, and people are dying because you are not addressing the problems.
Okay, a woman here in front in the pink dress.
The problem is, I just wish she's absolutely 100% correct, right? But I just want people to call it out on an ideological basis, right? And just come to them and say, no, you won't call it a crisis because you don't want to accept there's a crisis because you think that this crisis is good for your political aims, right? The bigger the crisis in the NHS, the more justification you have for being able to palm it off onto the private sector and to destroy the institution that you've wanted to destroy for the past 50 years. It's as simple as that. I wish they would call it out.
So I'm an emergency nurse practitioner. I've only been qualified actually for 4 years.
Oh my goodness, it feels like our audience is full of people. I know it isn't, but I seem to have unerringly seem to have found you. Yes.
I've only actually been qualified for 4 years. I've been on the front line prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, post-pandemic. I'm going to put this bluntly. It's like a war zone. There's beds everywhere. There's patients everywhere. There's elderly people. elderly people who are sitting on chairs for 24 hours. It's not okay no more. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed now. Like in 2019, there was a manifesto pledge that there was going to build 40 new hospitals. That hasn't even been done remotely, even looked into. Where are they finding the staff to even staff those? Because they can't retain the staff they've got because they don't know how to look after them. All we get told is we're not skilled enough. We need to justify a pay rise. And I think we've justified it enough. We're tired and we've had enough.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to come around the rest of the panel. I just want
Like, and she's absolutely right. It's a fucking obscene. It's completely obscene for Steve Barclay to go into the union negotiations, right? For him to go into the union negotiations with Unite and with the RCN, and then come out saying that you can only justify a higher pay rise than what's being kind of dished out by the independent pay review body that is actually independent because it's appointed by the government and has to go in with the specified budgetary constraints anyway. To then come out and say, well, you need to increase productivity. How fucking embarrassing is that? How obscene is that? Considering that there are so many parts of the departments that only actually function off of the fact that people are doing overtime. The staffing levels are nowhere near what they need to be. People are working their fingers to the bone to stop people dying. And Steve Barclay has the absolute fucking temerity to come out in these union meetings and expect productivity increases when they're already stretched to their limit. It's inhuman. It's fucking ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. I cannot believe this government. I mean, obviously they're Tories. I can believe them, but I don't want. I just wish that we weren't just a country run by bad people, just horrendously awful people.
to give you one last chance, Alex. Do you want to admit the NHS is in crisis? Well, if the Prime Minister doesn't, hearing this, do you want to?
There is no doubt that the pressures are
No,
at
and you
historic
said that.
levels.
Do you want to say
The reason why
crisis?
I say that is because talk is cheap, action is what matters.
No, I'm not asking what you're asking. You've made clear already about the money.
Yes or no?
Yes, that's what I'm asking you.
It's incredibly intense, and the pressures are
Okay, so you don't want to use that word. I think we've got that. You clearly don't want to use that word.
No, but it's the actions that matter.
I know we've heard that. I'm just asking about the
There's
word.
a crisis. Listen to people.
And
They're on the front line.
Bridget.
It's clear that the NHS is in crisis and it's facing the greatest crisis in its history. And those of you working in the NHS see it every day. But what everyone who uses the NHS and needs the NHS every day, they also see that. Because if you look at how long people have to wait, stroke victims, heart attack victims, an hour and a half when every second counts, sometimes more than 3 hours in order for an ambulance to arrive. And we're in the ludicrous position at the moment where Conservative ministers are talking about introducing minimum standards during strikes. You can't guarantee on a normal day that you will get an ambulance when you need it, and that is terrifying. It is terrifying for everybody that the NHS is not there for us when we need it.
So
and
what does Labour think the answer is?
Absolutely. So
I'm not suggesting it's simple, but what do you think the answer is?
It's far from simple because, the next Labour government will inherit an NHS that has had 13 years of Conservative mismanagement and underinvestment. So it will take time to put it right. It took time
So where are you going to start?
It took time after 1997, and we fixed it, and we transformed the NHS, and we will do it again. And that will come down.
Obviously, I have huge amounts of issues with the Labour Party right now, and more generally, historically, since 1997, since the kind of the era of Tony Blair. Right, I have my issues with the Labour Party, but how anybody who ever needs to be on the NHS, the retired, constantly vote for fucking 60% for the Conservative Party. I'm like, you are the people who most rely on the health service, and you are voting for a party that has an ideological predisposition to completely destroy it. What the fuck are you doing? Why do anyone vote for the Conservative Party anymore? I don't get it. You can even see, right? There's the graph that people get that circles Twitter every single bloody day, where it just goes where the waiting times go up during the Conservative Party administration. They go down during Labour, and then they go back up again when the Tories come back into power. I'm just like what is more important to you than your own fucking health? What is more important to you than the ability to keep yourself alive, to have that there for you in your time of need? And you're just like, well, actually, I don't want to get taxed more, so that I might. So I was going to buy a motorcycle with that. It's very, very difficult for you to, for you to be able to ride the motorcycle that you've got with your tax cuts. If it means that if you crash, you can't have an ambulance to save your life in that crisis, right? What the hell are these people doing? I don't get it. It's just madness to me. It's absolutely madness. Again, it's just these people who just think entirely in terms of their pension if they're retired or their mortgage if they're not. It's the only things these people think about because they just it's such blinkered short-termism.
to workforce. We need more doctors, we need more nurses, we need to change the way that the NHS works. And that's why we've set out the most ambitious plan for a generation around recruiting that next generation of doctors and nurses.
And yet their plan for recruiting more doctors and nurses is to tell them that they're not going to get the pay rise that they wanted, and continually dragging their feet over the idea of committing to proper remuneration for our hard-working medical staff in this country. And then also we have Keir Starmer and West Streeting going to war with the BMA over NHS structuring and over privatisation in the health service itself, because West Streeting has already said it wants to do further privatisation for no reason, and the fact that it doesn't work because there's no spare capacity and no spare doctors, right? That's the private sector in this country cannot prop up the public sector in health. That's just nonsense, completely nonsensical, right? On the short-term basis that he says that he's going to do it. Doesn't make sense. Novara did a great article. It's by Health Stats, really worth reading, about why this spare capacity myth is wrong. And then they're also like going to war over GP contracts when they're already relying on a bunch of people who have to do overtime, and now they're not. And now they're just trying to make enemies of the doctors. Like, why is West Streeting trying to be the new Jeremy Hunt, and then immediately inherit a government where they've got massive war with the doctors and nurses and the medical professionals in this country? West Streeting to be saying, well, my manifesto commitment for the as shadow health secretary is to ensure that you people fucking hate me. What the hell is this man doing? Do they think they're going to win over people in the NHS by saying, well, we're going to go to war with you just slightly less than the Conservative Party? We have an entire political class that are completely out of ideas, completely out of any kind of semblance of how to solve any of these problems, because again, we have an entire political class that only know neoliberalism. They only know the managerial style, fiscal discipline style neoliberalism, because the ideological precept of what I believe in, which is a kind of supply side leftism philosophy and political ideology, have been explicitly driven out of the political consciousness and the political Overton window by a nasty and underhanded smear campaign by both the media, the Conservative Party and the Labour right to demonise left-wing elements of the Labour Party and the political discourse in this country. And this is the reason, and we are now seeing the after effects, where we have a party over 20 points ahead in the polls, who is literally promising nothing and saying everything is going to get worse, and actually making the lives for themselves worse by making the enemies of the people who they should be natural bedfellows with. I'm at my wits' end with this country.
So that those colleagues already working in the NHS have got that extra backup, because we are losing people in their droves, because the pressure is just enormous. You know, when I speak to people locally working in the NHS as well, nobody goes into public service or goes to work in the NHS to come home feeling that they've let people down, or that they're burnt out, or that they can't cope. And that's why people leave. And under
to recruit
Labour,
all these extra people, will you expect people to pay more taxes to pay for that?
So we would fund that by ending the non-dom tax status. So people that are the wealthiest in our society.
That's not going to cover all that.
It will absolutely. No, it does cover it all. The plan that we set out, a fully funded, fully costed plan to end the non-dom tax status. The current Chancellor, when he was chair of the Health Select Committee, said it was a great idea. I would love it if your government adopted Labour's plan and got on and did it, because people can't wait.
All right, Tim.
I think the best chance you've got of seeing a doctor nowadays on the NHS is to go on Question Time, because...
It's only beginning to feel that way.
I think the government is reluctant to use the crisis word for two reasons. One, because it doesn't want to panic people, so that people will stop trying to stop using the service if they think it's completely broken down. So I think there's a rational thinking behind it. The other reason is they want the idea to percolate that there are things beyond the government's control that are responsible for this, notably COVID and lockdown and flu. The problem with that argument is that the service was in a poor shape before COVID and the lockdown. And it was in a poor shape in particular because of a failure to reform certain things, like the way that GPs work, because of a failure to invest in social care, which is why you've got horrible term bed blocking on the NHS.
Oh, Tim, was this the party that you told everybody to vote for as part of as the editor of the political editor of the Tory Graph, right? Did you tell everyone that Jeremy Corbyn was like a maniac Marxist trying to destroy the country and take us back to the 1970s? Therefore, you get exactly what you fucking wanted with the lack of investment in social care? I wonder which political party at the last election was promising a national care service to sort these issues out. Could it have been the party you told nobody to vote for? Oh, that's it. Oh, it is indeed exactly what you wanted, isn't it, Tim? Exactly what you wanted.
And also because of a failure to invest. Now, it is true, the government will immediately say, but we have recruited more staff, we have spent more money in real terms. That's true. But the thing about health spending is it has to increase year on year well above inflation for it to keep pace with growing need, and particularly with an elderly population and changing technology. So the problem is that the government can say, here's the figure we put in. It's not enough year by year to meet the demands of a rising population. So the solution is either a significant increase in tax, and taxes have already gone up, or some other kind of root and branch reform, which I'm wondering if people are starting to think might be possible. I was very interested that Wes Streeting, the Labour Shadow Health Secretary, has said that they'll use more private beds. Well, what about using more private medicine? I mean, when it comes to, for example, in Australia, higher rate taxpayers are effectively obliged to buy private insurance, and there's been a large increase in people doing that. Now, from all my years of going on Question Time, I know that the two most unpopular things to suggest to support are incest and private medicine. But nonetheless, I think we're reaching a point where people can see that this current structure does not meet the needs of an aging and growing population.
But where do you draw that line, right? Because to be able to draw the line enough so that you're actually being able to take any amount of strain off of the NHS, again, it becomes completely nonsensical. And as I mentioned before, the quote-unquote spare private healthcare capacity does not fucking exist, right? If you make like rich people buy private healthcare insurance, then they're still going to have to use the NHS when they go to A&E. You do not get emergency coverage on private healthcare in this country, and even then, there's not even the spare capacity to do it.
And perhaps we need a royal commission. We need some kind of broad, honest discussion about what we can afford, what's not working, and we've got to fix it in the long term. Short-term, cash injection, long-term, structural reform.
I shall come to you in a minute. I'm just going to go around the audience a bit more. Yes, we're all here.
And we have the entirety, like, they're clapping him saying structural reform of the NHS. Like, we're at the point where Chomsky is literally fucking the Nostradamus that he always is. Just defund it and ruin it until it becomes so poor that you can justify privatization. It's it. We're seeing in front of our eyes now. The NHS must be reformed or whatever. It is become received wisdom within the collective political psyche of this country, where people will just think that it is the thing that needs to happen. We need to undo the Lansley reforms and take it back to how it was pre-2014 or whenever it was. Right? We need to do that, but that's not a reform. That's just going back to the way it was. There's not some kind of new model. But we just need to fund it more. We just need to fund it more. And again, the only reason why, as I've said this 1,000 times on this channel already, but I will continue saying it, the reason why taxes are so much higher now than they ever have been to pay for this stuff is because there is no other source of revenue for this government, right? There are no SOEs, there's no ability for them to gain additional revenue through tax because all of these revenue-generating SOEs got sold off by the neoliberal class, right? It's why we have high taxes now. It's why Blair used PFIs, because there is nothing, in a post-Thatcher world, our state is entirely bare bones, right? There's no ability for us to be able to generate revenue for the state outside of taxes, and people expect good public services. That's why we're in the situation that we're in now, and why the Conservatives have promised more funding for public services, not because they want to or because they believe in it, but because they know they can't get elected if they don't fund these public services, especially not the NHS and education, which is where the biggest amount of allocation for new funds went in the previous budget from October, I think it was. So they're in this kind of incredibly difficult position where they don't want high taxes, they want strong public services, but they don't want a quote unquote big government. And I'm sorry, well, you can't have all three of these things at once. You have to make some concessions. It's clear they've made the concession of increasing taxation because they would rather be seen as being hypocritical on their low tax credentials than they would to completely violate their economic orthodoxy about the kind of supremacy of the market conditions with regards to whether or not something would be better demarketized or not, because they believe everything is better marketized. So they can't go away from that ideological orthodoxy that they inhabit. So they just have to increase taxes in the short term. Which, of course, Liz Truss didn't want to do. And that's why we knew, because her plan was completely crackpot and nonsensical, she then ended up tanking the economy and also the Conservative Party, possibly for good, right? We're looking at Reform UK possibly being the 4th biggest party in the country. And they're only taking votes off the Tories.
Glasses.
I worked in the NHS for 8 years as a registered nurse. And I left nearly 12 years ago because of disability after attacked by a care work assistant, support worker, for no reason. It was just racially motivated. In the NHS, there is violence from workers to workers, not from patients to workers. There's violence, there's bullying, there's racism, there's discrimination. And people are moving out of the NHS, not because they don't want to work in the NHS, but it's toxic. It's so toxic in the NHS. I was attacked first time 2003 by a ward sister. And then I was attacked 2011 by a support worker. Now I'm disabled, I can't work, I'm disabled for life. I'm on benefits. My life is destroyed.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
My life is destroyed. And all what the hospital wants, instead of tackling the situation, because they have got all the opportunities, when things like this happen, they've got the opportunity to make things right. But what they do is they take everything, move everything, sweep everything under the carpet. And that continues and continues and continues.
Well, look, I'm so sorry to, and thank you for sharing. Thank you is the right word, but thank you for sharing your experience with it. I'm very, very sorry to hear about it. I'll take a few more points from the rest of the audience. The man here in the blue shirt.
I'm currently a junior doctor as well. I'm working as a teaching fellow in one of the hospitals nearby.
Can I just, everyone put their hands down. How many NHS workers are in this audience? Put your hands up. Right, well, I guess, well, I just seem to have found you all somewhere. But anyway, yes, okay, put your hands back up. Yes, man in the blue shirt.
I think much of the underfunding and the pressures and strain that's currently going on is having quite a large impact as well on the repercussions of undergraduate education. I'm obviously teaching and educating the next generation of medical students where they're now actually struggling to get the opportunities they require to be trained appropriately. And actually it's making a lot of them put off having to work in the NHS going forward.
You're right, boy,
so
Miss
I
Spinning,
suspect
how you
actually
doing?
this will have a large impact on vacancies going forward. And much of my students come to me anyway as a result, asking what other opportunities they have to be looking outside of the NHS.
Gosh, even after going through all that training. The man here in the front in the blue sweater. Yes.
Yeah, almost every week on Question Time, the government representative says, we've been hiring all of these people, we're increasing this number, we're increasing that number. But that is completely irrelevant if the people there are leaving. If you're only filling the people that are leaving, it's not improving the situation.
Yeah, true.
I mean, there are actually, despite how it feels to so many of us, there are actually more doctors and more nurses now than there were, let's say, in 2019, despite the numbers of people leaving.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I've been in and out of hospitals in the Birmingham area for the last 2.5 years for various different conditions, and the last time was in August.
The woman who was just speaking, that's Fiona Bruce, she's the moderator.
And I was in Solihull Hospital on a ward with 27 patients, and there were 2 nurses on the night shift, a man and a woman. Both of them got attacked by other patients during the night, and I ended up helping them because they just couldn't cope. And the female nurse in the morning said to me, I don't think I'm coming back tonight. I can't take it anymore. And if people are leaving in droves, you can hire as many as you want. It's not going to fix the problem. What you've got to do is keep the staff we've got.
Ash, we haven't heard from you yet.
And you don't keep the staff if you don't pay them a good fucking wage. If they continually get poorer and poorer and then have to end up, I don't know, using food banks because they're not getting enough money, like, then you're not going to be able to continue retaining them, which is the point that's been made 1,000 times, both on this channel and elsewhere. So there's probably no point in me continually reiterating it, but it just is the case that declining pay, 19-20% less than it was in real terms than it was in 2010. For doctors, it's 25% less than it was 13 years ago, is a completely damning indictment on this government.
I mean, the question is, when will the Prime Minister admit the NHS is in crisis?
Well, look, the reason why you don't want to admit that it's a crisis is because it makes your government look bad, and it's that simple. But if you can't be trusted to describe the problem, why should we trust you to fix the problem? It's wholly subjective.
There's a lot that's been said tonight that I obviously agree with. You need more staff in the NHS, you need to grow capacity, you need that capacity to keep up with the fact that we've got a growing and an ageing population. But there's one thing which I think we really need to talk about, and that is how you keep staff, the staff that you've got. Between 2010 and 2020, the real terms pay of doctors on average fell by around 25%. That is a huge devaluing of doctors' work. Do you think that doctors' work became 25% less useful during that time? No. You just decided to start paying them worse comparative to what they'd been paid before and forcing them to work in worse conditions. And when it came to your party's mates in the city, you said, well, in order to get the best talent, we've got to lift the cap on bankers' bonuses. Right. Pay's got to be competitive. But when it comes to things like the NHS or the education sector, you're effectively saying to all these public sector workers, get poorer and be happy about it. Now, why should any of them accept that?
That's not right.
Unless you're giving them a pay rise which keeps up with inflation, they are getting poorer.
So look, the position.
And she's absolutely right. I've seen this clip already because it's gone viral on Twitter. So your full disclosure, but there was this point was circulated, and all of the responses were, "But bankers aren't paid in the public sector," and I'm like, who cares? The rule of supply and demand applies no matter what the sector is, right? And the argument for getting rid of the cap on bankers' bonuses was the ability to be able to attract new talent and to retain talent in the banking sector, because that's where we needed all the talent, apparently. Yet when it actually comes to doctors and nurses, they don't think that that's worth it either, right? Obviously, it all cost public money, so you have to justify the additional expenditure from the government to be able to do that in the first place. But the principle remains the same with regards to the policy platform. There is that if we are taking it as read that the only way that we retain staff, the only way that we bring people in and remain competitive is by offering good enough salaries to be able to compete, for example, in the banking sector by giving the bonuses, then the exact principle should apply to the NHS as well. Otherwise, we're going to lose them to other countries, to other professions, to the private sector. I mean, and that's, again, what I keep saying as well, is the point of this, right? The more people who they move into the private sector, then hire them on like agency contracts or whatever, or to have them on subcontraction, or to be able to justify people moving their own healthcare into the private sector by expanding it further, so that it's not just this ancillary thing on the side of the NHS, but a different system altogether where they do have their own ability to treat emergencies. They do have more different kind of treatments available, so they don't just use NHS stuff and that like that as well. That will help them shrink the NHS. It'll make people pay for more for their own private healthcare, and it will make the people who donate to them, namely the interests of private healthcare, far more fucking wealthy. And that's the end. That is the goal at the end of the day. They cannot justify to themselves giving public sector workers a good pay rise because they don't want to undercut or overcut, I guess, the wage demands of the private sector. Because then if the public sector pay rises are high enough, suddenly that sends price signals throughout the labour market about what workers should be demanding for their wages elsewhere, and therefore how other companies that may be in similar sectors to the public sector will then have to compete with the government, and then their wages are pushed up too, which is what the private sector business owners who would then feel the pinch on that one are the people who donate to the Conservative Party. It's very simple. It's incredibly simple.
Is the way it's worked, and by the way, not just under the Conservative government, but under previous governments, is that these decisions, you try to take the politics out of it because there is a lot of...
At least if you have if you have private healthcare in the United States, right, it doesn't really happen because it's a cartel. But the principle is such that by having different insurance companies that people can go to, they will therefore compete for your business, right? I know that's not really how it happens, and it's still ludicrously expensive, and as all the evidence will show you, Medicare for all would bring people's healthcare costs down and not up. I take that as read right, but at least the principle is such that there would be some market competition between these private healthcare providers, right? What's happening over here is just slow phasing out of state-owned and state-run hospitals to state-paid for but privately contracted hospitals, which is the worst of both worlds. They have nobody to compete with. They're all run by mates of the Conservative Party, so they're never losing their contracts. They have no incentive to run a good service because they might as well want to take as much profit as possible. And it also means the state is paying too much money because the state is paying for the actual service itself, all of the overheads that go into the service, plus that particular contractor's profits on top of that. So it's worse value for the state, worse quality of service for the patient, and it will move more and more of the NHS's remit into the private sector, which is the absolute fucking dirt worst, and I'm absolutely sick of it. I'm so sick of it.
politics in this, of course, so that the pay review bodies have a look at it. And just to put that in some kind of context, in a previous dispute in the 1980s, it was actually the nursing union at that stage which called for this to be done by the pay review body. And
Nabil225 with the follow on Twitch. Welcome to the Justice Stream. Hope you're doing well.
I mean,
I'm sorry, if you're going back to the 1980s, it's such a weird argument. We're talking about what's going on in 2023. The fact is that you've got nurses using food banks, doctors moving to Australia where the pay is better, and that's because your pay isn't competitive.
But can I just explain how it works? Only because when I was the prisons minister, I actually made representations to the pay review body. So you have people who are highly expert people, qualified. Sometimes they might have a trade union background. Sometimes they might have other area of expertise. The government and the minister will give evidence.
Much appreciated, Nabil. I'm glad they gave you a recommendation. It's good to have you on stream.
About what is affordable. They can take expert evidence from elsewhere, and they will then reach a decision. And by the way,
but the pay review body is making decisions based on what funding you allocate. I'm sorry, this is such a ridiculous way for you to try and show responsibility.
This is a phony argument.
No, but I haven't made it yet. Can I just quickly finish that? Can I just finish the line?
Talking about pay reviews.
All right, go on. Let him get a word in fairness, and then you can come back.
Okay, so what happens is the government does submit evidence about what is affordable. Now, in this case, the pay review body came back and said, we're very interested, fascinating to hear your argument, but actually, we are going to make a settlement which is more than the government said was affordable. So now the government could turn around and say, well, look, we still can't afford it. But the government in this case said, okay, we will accept it. Every last penny that the independent pay review body asked for. And the point is this, who is suggesting, is anyone here suggesting we should get rid of the independent pay review body?
No, you're missing the point.
No, but if you accept it...
14 health unions have said they're not going to cooperate with the independent pay review. So yes, they are.
This is a phony
but the question
argument.
is, are the politicians saying...
I've said my bit. Because you can say you've got the pay review boards that say it's going to be 5%, 10%. The reality is, and if you're a proper Tory who believes in the market is telling you we have vacancies we cannot fill. So you say, well, why have we got those vacancies that we cannot fill? Notwithstanding your pay review board. And it's a combination, yes, of pay, but it's also the conditions. And as everybody else on this panel and in this audience has said, people are voting with their feet. They're burnt out, they're fed up. That is the problem.
When you were a minister, you dealt with pay review body.
No, I didn't.
Why didn't you say something about that?
Because you're missing the point. You can talk about pay review bodies. You're missing the point, which is the market is telling you, Alex, it doesn't matter about your pay review bodies.
Alex,
they're walking away. 160,000 vacancies in social care, 1 in 8 unfilled jobs in our NHS. It doesn't matter about your pay review bodies.
The trouble is, this misrepresents the work of the pay review bodies. The position that you've set out, ministers make representations. Yes, absolutely, they do that. Yeah. But they also give a steer to the pay review bodies.
I mean, you think 1 in 8, right? The NHS is the biggest employer in Europe. It's gigantic, right? They employ more people than Amazon. It's crazy. Like, that is an absolutely apocalyptic number of vacancies in the NHS.
About how they're to consider these matters. So, for example, government ministers could say to the peer review body, you must take account of recruitment and retention issues when considering the settlement that they put forward. If ministers were to do that, I think you would get a very different outcome from the peer review bodies. So to simply hide behind the peer review bodies and say, it's nothing to do with us, it's not the responsibility of government. Look, people expect that the government take responsibility for the NHS, not hiding behind others. And this will not be solved until ministers take some responsibility.
They agree with PRBs. Would you scrap the PRBs?
This is a ludicrous line. Of course we would not. This is a ludicrous line.
I tell you what.
But also then, the other thing as well is right, is he's already admitted, right, our ideological predisposition here was to pay them even less than what the pay review bodies were saying, and that we all realise that what the pay review bodies are saying isn't good enough because the unions aren't agreeing to it, right? And as I've said many times, right, if you look at it in real terms, if we look at nurses, who are the people who are seeing, we have the worst amount of retention, for example, in the nursing sphere, and the people who were the first people to announce their own industrial action, their real terms pay is 19% less than what it was in 2010. They've had a 19% pay cut in 13 years. That's completely ridiculous. Like, again, it doesn't really matter what the pay review body says. And for once, actually, I do agree with Anna Soubry. And it's just like, look, until you deal with this attrition problem by paying enough, you're going to continue losing staff, right? I guarantee you, right, that the best course of action, as far as they're concerned, is to just take the hit and do a massive pay rise now. You can give them they might have frozen pay in future, but to fix the recruitment issues right now and retention issues right now, you have to give them a massive pay rise, because otherwise it's only going to get worse. If you say, oh, well, in the course of over 3 or 4 years, their pay might go up by 15% or whatever it is in that specific time period, people will still leave because the conditions are too bad as well. You need a massive recruitment drive right now, and it's going to involve huge amounts of pay increases, right? You have to fix the retention issues immediately. It cannot wait. There is no time to wait and for a new government to come in for these retention issues to be solved. And once you've failed to retain enough staff, you could pay them fucking anything. And there's no way you're going to get them to turn up and do 13 hours a day to be shouted at by drunk people. And you can't fix that once the retention issue gets that bad. Once you've stopped retaining nurses so much so that any of the remainders literally physically cannot or do not want to do their job because it's too physically or mentally draining. No amount of money will fix that. So whilst you have the ability to be able to fix it with money, you have to do it immediately. You cannot wait.
Let's not go too far down the rabbit hole, Peer Review. Not that it's not important and it is critical to what's going on. I totally get that. But I feel we're going to spend the next half hour talking about peer review bodies if we're not careful. And there's a lot of hands up want to talk about the NHS, and also a lot of you put in questions about other things. I just want to tell you what we're doing next week, which will explain why I'm not going to take more questions from you now. Because next week, we're in Hoddesdon, just north of London, Hertfordshire, and we are doing a special edition of Question Time all about healthcare. All about what's happening in the NHS, in social care, what's happening to mental health care. That's what the whole programme is going to be about. So I'm going to cut the conversation short just for now. If you want to go to our website and be part of our audience, please do. We'd love to see you. I feel I almost don't need to say this because it's quite clear that we do get a lot of...
I mean, that's true, Nabil, but they will only care about pay up to a certain point, right? The issue we have, as I mentioned before, the issue we have in the NHS is the fact that people are just leaving in droves. We have huge amounts of vacancies because people, after 13 years of underfunding and overworking, have said, doesn't matter. I don't care how much I get paid. I don't care what it is. I'm just going to go stack shelves at the supermarket. Even if it pays less, I cannot deal with the stress of working in this environment anymore. And that's why I said that you have to do a massive pay rise right now to solve the issue in the long term. You can maybe not do bigger pay increases in future, but until you fix, because the problems that we have in retention are also problems of retention, right? We have a cyclical issue where people are underpaid and overworked so that they leave, which means that the remainder of the staff become more overworked, which means they're more likely to leave regardless of pay. So unless you fix pay now to fix the retention issues now, those retention issues will become exponentially worse down the line.
People coming from the NHS anyway. But obviously, if you work for the NHS or in social care, or you use it, you are affected by it, we particularly like to have you in the audience as well. So it'll be the whole programme, barring some big political cataclysm, which we also have to discuss. But otherwise, we're intending to spend the whole programme talking about what is happening in our healthcare. So that's next week in Hoddesdon. Go to our website. We'd love to have you there. OK, so I'm going to move on for now, important though this is, and go to Jim Goldstraw.
Is the right to strike a basic right of an employee, and should it be protected?
Right. OK. So, Jim, of course, what you're talking about is minimum service levels, which is something that the government wants to introduce, which basically means some of the workforce could strike, but have to be minimum service, and the government...
It's now under threat both here and across the pond. Like, whilst the Supreme Court are also mulling over the idea of essentially kneecapping voters' right to strike, over here we have obviously the stupid bloody minimum service bill, which doesn't even make sense for 90% of it.
Looking at areas such as health.
And the scary thing about the minimum service level bill that the government are trying to rush through the Commons is that it's also clearly been rushed in the way that it's been written, in that it spans a whole number of industries whilst also being really vague about the kind of industries that they're going to be doing it for, whilst also being very vague on what the numbers are, what the recommendations are. So it could be one of those bills that can be incredibly, easily differently interpreted to mean basically whatever they want it to mean, which I guess kind of is the point.
Transport, education, border security, nuclear decommissioning, I mean, it goes across all sorts of sectors. Bridget.
Yes, absolutely. The right to strike is an important fundamental principle in our democracy and the hallmark of a free and open society. If you end up having strikes, and sadly we are seeing industrial action right across a range of different areas of the public and private sectors, that's a symptom of failure. It represents a failure to arrive at a solution that everyone can live with. And I think we've seen tonight part of the reason why we're ending up with strikes, whether it's in our NHS or why we're seeing ballots taking place, for example, in our schools, because government ministers pretend that somehow this is nothing to do with them. Ministers should get around the table, whether that's the industrial action that we're likely to face in our schools or the industrial action that we're seeing in our NHS, get around the table and sort it out. The last thing that we need is further legislation in this area. You can't legislate your way out of an industrial action. You can't prevent it in that way. It is a total distraction from the big fundamental challenges that we face as a country.
And do you think there's any role at all, given that other countries do have it to various degrees in different shapes and forms, for any role for minimum service?
I would love to see minimum services in the NHS right now.
No, I get that, you made that.
We don't have
but
that.
across other areas as well, such as transport, for example.
Well, the Transport Secretary actually said he doesn't think the legislation is going to work in the transport sector. The Education Secretary said she doesn't want it in education. So I don't think it's going to work, and I don't think it's the answer. And in those countries that do have it, you've seen increased industrial action and you've seen legal challenge. If ministers spent a little bit more time seeking to pry and find a way through it and to get a settlement, rather than engaging in this kind of distraction activity around legislation, then we'd be in a much stronger position where it comes to the NHS and our schools.
Alex.
Well, I respectfully but fundamentally disagree. So it's not just the British government saying that this is a reasonable thing to do. The International Labour Organization says it's a reasonable thing to do. And as has been indicated, this is something that applies in France.
Again, they only said it for a couple of sectors. They definitely didn't say it for transport or education. Healthcare and nuclear decommissioning, maybe.
In Italy, in Spain. Now,
but when you mention the International Labour Organization, they say, as you're right, because I looked into this, because this was something that the Prime Minister mentioned yesterday, but they say minimum service levels are a proportionate way of balancing the right to strike, but only to cover safety of individuals and their health. So that would not include a lot of things the government is suggesting, such as education, for example.
Well, I mean,
I just think if you're going to quote them, you might as well quote the whole thing.
No, that's absolutely right. But what I wanted to say is that we already have in our country, there are certain sectors that can't strike. So the police is an obvious one. But if you go to other countries, namely the United States and Canada, if you work in the health sector, you can't strike at all. Now, we're not saying you can't strike at all, because as the point the gentleman was making, of course, you have to be able to strike that balance. However, when it comes to issue of life and limb, if you or someone you love, your friend, your mother, your sister, if you don't know that someone will come when there's literally a risk to life, I don't think that's the right time.
That's a normal day at the moment.
But the NHS...
Well, we can talk about the plan on these specifics, but...
I mean, they're right. That is literally what the NHS like is currently. When you're waiting half an hour for an ambulance for literally like a life or death situation. Like, the ambulance arrives and you're dead already. Like, what's the point, right? Minimum service regardless, that's not going to help. Although, with all these people who are desperate to ensure that strikes don't happen, do you just want all of our healthcare professionals to just fucking quit and then everyone dies, right? Is that what you want? Because that's what you'll get. That's literally what you'll get. Even the RCN said themselves that it isn't even as far as they're concerned about any personal amount of pay or remuneration. That's because they understand the NHS far more than any of these bloody fucking politicians do. Right? They understand it far more than any of these idiot politicians do, and they understand from the basic principle that the pay rise needs to happen to save the NHS based on because of retention, and that's why they ask for 19%. Because they don't care about their own individual pay packet. They said as much as the RCN representatives have said as much. They especially explicitly said, we know that this is the only way to continue having a functioning NHS by having pay packets that stop our attrition levels and ensure that we retain staff moving forward, whilst also hiring new ones to be able to keep it going. And that's a very admirable position for them to take. And it's up to you, government, right? Do the pay or lose it, or do the pay increase or just lose it, or just completely lose it all.
I'm just saying that we have to get to a point where there's a risk to life and limb that people should be able to. And can I just make this one last point?
Paramedics.
Thing is, boy meets Minnie. I don't know if you've seen, but the minimum service level legislation the government are trying to put in will give the government the ability to be able to sue the unions for going on strike and not providing that minimum service level. So there's going to be the points at which they're going to try and bankrupt the unions over people who strike when they're quote unquote not supposed to. It's absolute insanity.
You will have seen people leaving picket lines during strikes to respond to precisely those calls.
But can I deal with that specific point? So one of the things that was very responsible, if I, again, may respectfully say so, is the nursing union said in advance, this is what we will provide along the lines that you indicated. But there were other sectors which didn't. And so you had a perverse situation where literally 2 minutes to midnight, not metaphorically, literally, the Secretary of State was finding out what ambulance cover was going to be provided the following day. So all this is saying is that we should be able to know in advance, so you haven't got regional...
Then how about you fucking negotiate with the unions? Like, it's your fault, right? The RCN gave the government a week to come to the table and give them some kind of payoff, or even come to the negotiations before they would ballot on strike action. The government said no, and so the strike was called. It's incredibly simple, right? Like, if you want them to be no strikes, then take action to avoid it in the first place. But the government doesn't want to do that. And they didn't even want to turn up to the fucking talks. The talks have now happened, and that was when Steve Barclay said his dumb shit about there needing to be productivity increases from an incredibly overworked and overstretched workforce. This government is for fun. Not only are they fundamentally like genuinely evil people, they're also catastrophically stupid as well. They're just like incredibly moronic. I cannot think of more superlative words to describe how bad this government is.
Discrepancies where an ambulance will come in these circumstances in the northwest but not in the southeast, but so that you can see transparently and in advance.
Oh, are you saying there might be different levels of coverage depending on where you are in the country? Oh, isn't that not because of the Lansley reforms that literally your fucking government did? Oh, isn't that a shame? Is that a massive case of you getting what you wanted there, Alex?
What are those minimum
It's not just about health,
The nurses said, but ahead of Christmas, the nursing union said, if ministers sit down and talk to us about pay, we'll call off the strikes. Why didn't they do it?
But that's a separate. We are
It's not a
absolutely
separate issue. It's at the heart of the
It is,
issue.
but the question, in fairness, the question is
services.
the right to strike a basic right, and it's not just about health. And I need to keep bringing it back to that, but it's about, quoting the government here, border security, nuclear decommissioning, education. Let's hear from some of our. The woman with the glasses there in the middle. Yes.
It's more of a comment, really. I absolutely support this right to strike. I think we should do it, and I'd like to invite Alex, the government, and the Tories to strike immediately, because we could absolutely go without your service.
How do you know the difference?
The man in front in the blue jacket.
So I find it ironic that we're talking about a legal strike, because a strike is an act of defiance and really an example of how the government has failed to negotiate and reach a particular settlement on.
They've failed to negotiate implies they even tried in the first place. They've just not even negotiated.
A particular issue. I don't think we need to have a legal strike. If people want to strike and rebel against a government that they feel is oppressing them, it should be their right to do so. And absolutely, I think that by forcing people who don't want to work, that's the beginning of what could be a police state.
Just in the interest of getting a varied opinion from the audience, is there anyone in the audience who does think that having minimum service legislation is a good idea? Yes, there are a few. So let's hear from you as well, just in the interest of getting a balance of opinion. Yes, the man there with the red hair and the blue polo top. Yeah.
I do think that the thought of one of our family members lying in a desperate state, waiting for an ambulance and it not turning up due to a strike, is something that none of us could imagine. And I think the desperation people would feel. I've waited for an ambulance for a broken arm, and that is not as extreme as someone waiting for a stroke. And I can just imagine someone feeling with a stroke, waiting up for it on the floor, waiting for one of our heroes. They are heroes, our NHS, coming to save us in our desperate state of need, and that not happening is genuinely to show that the NHS is at breaking point and it needs a solution, and the government needs to get up, make a solution, and do it quickly.
Okay, and the man behind you with the actually both men have got glasses. Let's hear from both of you. Yes, the guy with the black jumper. Yeah.
So, I agree with right to strike only in the same breath if you actually in law set out that these key workers would actually get all the pays related to inflation.
So hang on, when you say you agree with the right strike, you mean you agree with the idea that there should be minimum strike legislation? Is that
Correct.
what you mean? Yes.
Only if they are getting paid inflation rates. So then they won't need to strike, and you can set your minimum levels.
So just whatever salary you want, but you can't strike. Is that what you're saying?
In a sense, related to inflation.
Right. Okay. And what about the man in front of you in the glass as well?
All the issues that we've raised all relate down to inflation. So it's inflation that's eroding people's pay, and obviously it's conditions also. The government needs to start tackling inflation first.
Okay. Also, let me just get around the panel bit, and I'll come back to you, Ash.
So do you know why they're trying to make it harder for people to go on strike? Because it's very simple. This government is scared of what happens when workers organise collectively together. They're scared that after 12 years of stagnant and falling living standards, of not getting pay rises in the good times, now there's a cost of living crisis, you can't get a pay rise now either, that people are realising that the only power they have is collective bargaining, and when being pushed to it, withdrawing their labour. So that's why they're trying to push through this, frankly, pathetic package of measures to try and restrict people's right to exercise that fundamental democratic right. And if people are out there thinking about organising their workplaces, this should give them heart, that the government are on the back foot, and it's pathetic, quite frankly.
Tim.
I agree with you, Ash. The government is scared, but I don't think they're scared of that. I think they're scared of an inflationary spiral of wage demands.
That's exactly it. But hang on,
you can't have a wage price spiral in the public sector. There's no profits to protect. That's where the wage price spiral comes from. You can't have a wage price spiral in the public sector. It's nonsensical. Actually, I was looking at an article from the Cato Institute, no less, that said that wage price spiral was untrue as well, which I think is quite funny. But I think that the issue that we have is that no one is demanding a pay rise. The only people who are demanding an above inflation pay rise is the nurses specifically, right? Most sectors are looking for just below inflation, although there have been some sectors that have seen above inflation. I think there were some bin men and some airport staff that got 17% pay rises, but most people pay rises they're looking for are around the 9 or 10% mark, which is below RPI, which is 11%. But actually the stealth reason that their government are scared and trying to forestall these agreements and forestall these disputes and ensure that they can essentially run the clock out on these strikes, for example, is that currently the RPI rate of inflation is based off of the previous 12 months, right? So as time moves on, certain previous months of high inflation will drop out of the statistics. So as inflation goes down, as the headline level of inflation goes down over time, as inflation does, also as the normal level of current inflation drops over time too, that will mean that even though prices are higher, like the prices aren't going, it's no deflation, it's just a drop in the level of inflation, right? As the headline of that goes down, the pay demands will seem optically less reasonable as this goes on, right? So obviously RPI is 11% now. 6 months' time, it might be 6%. People will still be, 11, 12% or whatever it is, out of pocket in real terms. So they will still need a 12% pay rise to be able to get back up to that point. But because the headline rate of inflation will only be 6%, they will seem less reasonable optically in the public perspective, right? And so that's why they want to weigh out the clock. That's what they're trying to do, and it's incredibly cynical. But it's entirely relying on people who don't quite understand, or are who aren't paying enough attention to the totality of the dispute over the full length of the dispute, right? And it's really sneaky, really sneaky.
Prices are going up in the private sector, and they're not going up in the public sector. How can you make the claim that you're scared of a wage price spiral?
Well, this comes back to the question about health versus bankers' bonuses. The point is that wages and bonuses can go up in the private sector because you and I ain't paying for them. But when it comes to a nationalised, publicly owned industry like health, then it's a different matter.
But you said it's a wage price spiral, which is something different.
Someone on this panel should defend minimum. Right. First of all, they're afraid of an inflationary spiral. Secondly, they're afraid of the government getting involved directly in negotiations because we can't go back to a situation like the 1960s and 70s where
the government's already getting directly involved in the negotiations. The government is already ensuring that the negotiations between the rail operators and the RMT fail, because even as Tim Shoveler admitted this as much in the Select Committee hearings, in that they agreed to that, first of all, that the government is indemnifying the rail operators during the strike action for any lost profits during those days, right? So that's between I think it was Tim Shoveler's business partner, or someone who he knows, or someone from a similar part of the industry, who was saying that between 300 and 500 million pounds of public money has been used to essentially bail out the rail networks, to indemnify them during the strike action so they don't lose money. And second of all, they're intervening in the negotiations specifically by forcing the operators to add in additional terms to the agreement that they know that the RMT can't accept. They're already going in and saying, well, there has to be this number of driverless trains, there has to be this number of redundancies, there has to be this specific part of the legislation that they know is going to scupper the talks, because the RMT have a specific red lines, which, to the rail operators' merits, they are at least on some of these backing off to try and get some kind of agreement put through to stop the strikes. But the government is explicitly wanting the strikes to continue by hamstringing the ability of the operators to negotiate. First of all, by ensuring that they can't even negotiate in good faith because they're not losing anything during the strike days, thereby nullifying the actual power of withdrawing the labour in the first place as far as the operator is concerned, at least on a short-term basis. And second of all, by just making sure that the agreement is completely unworkable as far as the unions are concerned. It's so, the fact that Tim isn't bringing any of this up, it just shows how embedded in the Conservative Party, even the fucking Telegraph is.
Where whenever there's a strike at a factory, the government goes in with beer and sandwiches and tries to negotiate an outcome. They don't want that. They want to go back to a corporatist model. And finally, they're frightened, they're scared of services grinding to a halt because of strike action. And for anyone who's, for instance, been grounded for the last few...
No, but that's the opposite. They are making sure that more strike action does happen by interfering in the negotiations where they shouldn't be interfering, and by not engaging in the negotiations that they should be engaging in. The reason why the strikes are continuing to go on is because of the government, and it's also because of the government. When you look at Royal Mail, The reason why the strike action is continuing is because of the incredibly stupid reason that they were that was privatised in the first place by an incredibly ridiculous plan by the Cameron administration that sold it off way less than it should have been sold off for, whilst also keeping the pensions in the public purse as well. So this is just a nightmare fucking cavalcade of Conservative missteps on every single step of the way.
Few weeks by train strikes, that's a perfectly reasonable concern. The problem with the withdrawal of Labour, which is a democratic right, one wants to sustain it, one wants to keep it, of course, is that if a train driver goes on strike and it stops the service from running, that has an effect upon people doing their job. It has an effect upon them being able to access health.
But those train drivers are missing out on their pay too.
And also, for the
For
gentleman in the audience who said this is a step towards a police state, the government's point is it's not, because several liberal democracies have these minimum service level arrangements already in place. And moreover, some of those liberal democracies go even further and ban strikes on frontline work altogether. Now, having said all of that, because one doesn't want to have to do this sort of thing, because one doesn't want to see striking, the government has failed in its first responsibility, which is to make sure that this doesn't arise, that we don't have an inflationary crisis, and that we don't have people feeling they have to go on strike. The public could quite reasonably say, OK, minimum service levels for unions, but why isn't the government required to deliver a minimum service level? Because I don't know about you, when the strikes on the trains first started, my initial reaction was, how could you tell? Because the service was rubbish before the strikes began. It's completely unreliable in my area, and many younger people entering the workforce now see trains in particular no longer as a challenge to navigate, but an obstacle to avoid. And they will start to get jobs and live in areas where they can take the bus or they can drive, and as a result, an industry, through a combination of private greed or government error or the workers going on strike, is going to end up destroying itself. So this all has to...
What's amusing, he says, government greed, corporate greed, government error, and also the workers going on strike, as if one of them isn't entirely downriver of the other two, right? The workers are going on strike because of the corporate greed. The workers are going on strike because of the government error. It's the fact that we privatised this shit in the first place was obviously a dumb plan in the first place, right? Which means you have the corporate greed factor there at play already, regardless. But the fact that the franchise model is so traumatically poorly designed is why we're in the mess with regards to the actual service levels in the first place. That's the real problem. And the fact that there are now corporate bosses who are trying to protect profits by putting down workers' wages is exactly why the rail network, both in levels of service and levels of investment, and as far as the workers that actually work in the services, quality of service, that's why it's in the mess that it's in, because of the ridiculous privatisation and also the really poor model and actual government mismanagement of the whole thing from start to finish. Bro in the tweed has never worked in his life. Well, yeah, that's why when they're wearing tweed, you can just tell, right?
Be resolved. But I don't like this legislation, but the idea that this is an attempt to break the unions, or that this is an assault upon working people, there are other working people who are suffering because of the strikes, and governments in the round have to consider their needs as well.
Okay.
No, but the reason why other workers are being affected by the strikes is because the government isn't doing a good enough job to ensure they don't go ahead by, in multiple different cases, ensuring that they do go ahead.
I know you want to come. Just a couple more points. The man at the very back in the blue t-shirt.
So, fortunately, I would love to work in an industry where we had minimum service levels. Currently, the organisation I work for, there's a permanent court induction, which stops me from striking.
So what industry is that?
I'm a prison officer.
Right.
So, currently, I don't have the right to strike. I should do. I'm a trade unionist. I'm not allowed to. If me and my colleagues talk about withdrawing our labour, we're contravening, and then we're in contempt of court.
And do you think there are other sectors that should have the same injunctions that you have?
I think if it affects the prison service and affects the Prison Officers Association, it should affect everybody else. If not, it shouldn't affect us. So,
what, you mean all public sector workers shouldn't be allowed to strike?
No, it shouldn't affect us. Sorry, I'm not coming across clearly. It shouldn't affect anybody. Right. So everybody should have the right to strike. We can't have a two-tier system where certain people can, so the NHS, doctors, but prison officers and police officers can't.
And the man here in the front.
The issue I have with this problem is this is a reactive policy to the strikes that have been started off by the train workers that have got momentum through other public services, and I don't think it's appropriate for government to, instead of identifying the problem and finding a solution, to just legislate the problem away without recognising the problem and providing a solution for the people. I think it's quite telling that in the last couple of discussions, Alex won't recognise that the NHS is in crisis. We're now legislating against strikes to try and restrict that. And I think it's quite telling of kind of the approach the government has.
Okay, Alex, I'll come back and let you answer that. So, Anna, what about Tim's point that there are other countries, I mean, France, Spain, and Italy, for example? I mean, some of these.
I just want to go on because I know I've obviously done, covered the strike action, the union movement a lot recently, and I just want to shout in these people's faces like it's the government's fault. The government was the one who didn't come to the negotiations. The government was the one who scuppered the talks between the RMT and the railway operators. It was the government's fault for privatising Royal Mail in the first place, right? This all comes back down to a government that is explicitly and ideologically committed to keeping workers' wages down to protect the corporate profits of their mates who donate to ensure they stay in power.
Strike agreements are voluntary, but nonetheless there is legislation
well,
there.
As far as from what I can read, most of those countries don't enact this law in any event. But
they do have it, though.
Yeah, but this is I'm with Bridget on this. This is a complete distraction. The question that really we should all be debating is why we have a government that is absolutely incapable of settling these strikes, which it does have a role in, and sorting it out. And the answer is because we've got largely, Alex is probably one of the few exceptions, a bunch of incompetents, and we feel like we're being governed by teenagers, and it's about time we had the grown-ups back in charge.
I can agree with like the main thrust of her point. I'm just completely fucking sick of people talking about grown-up politics, right? I'm absolutely sick of that term because all it is just a catch-all term with no actual precepts behind it, used to rally like-minded individuals behind some kind of level of mutual agreement without even stating what that mutual agreement is, right? Saying, well, these people are bad because they're not the grown-ups, right? It was the same charge that was levied at the Labour left during the Corbyn years, right? Saying, well, it's not grown-up politics, right? Because the underwritten assumption that they were all agreeing is that grown-up politics meant managerial neoliberalism, right? It meant monetarist approaches to fiscal policy. That's what it meant as far as they're concerned, their belief in fiscal discipline, right? For example. And so when they say grown-up politics, right? Everyone around them thinks they mean, behaving in a responsible manner, I guess. Probably the best kind of corollary to that. But what it really means on an ideological sense is there is an incredibly narrow overton window of views that we think are acceptable within the political sphere, and anything outside that must come from people who are too stupid to understand politics. Or too stupid to warrant even considering having some kind of political viewpoint, right? Because 5 years ago, when we were trying to campaign, right, when we were trying to get leftist policies in government, they said, you can't do that policy, it's ridiculous, you're not being grown up about this. When the policy when you looked at it in fiscal terms, was absolutely fine. It would have like John McDonnell, when he was writing the Labour manifestos, even had discussions with the Office of Budget Responsibility about what would be a reasonable thing to be able to include it as far as budgets go. You had red lines about what they would borrow money for and what they wouldn't. It's very simple, and that was fine for discussions amongst the economic and sphere. Like, we had a bunch of economists that backed Labour's plans for spending. But because people like Anna Soubry, for example, would have looked at it and gone, oh, that's different from the incredibly, minuscule sphere of what I believe to be acceptable political viewpoints. So regardless of its efficacy in the real world and its overall productive utility, I will think that it's ridiculous purely on the fact that it doesn't sit within my blinkered worldview of what should or shouldn't be even considered a legitimate political position in the first place. And we've seen that the end result of this politics has to be grown up is explicitly been used to try and marginalise the left overall, right? To make sure that the left don't have a seat at the table when discussing policy issues, because it's being treated for no actual proper reason. No one's told you why it won't work or why it's bad or why it's negative utility, just because it doesn't fit in with their incredibly non-heterodox view of economics. And in fact, people will view heterodox economics as being extremists on the back end. That's kind of the key part of centrism. Centrism isn't about looking at both sides and picking the best one. It's about looking at any amount of policies that fall outside of the status quo of what political policy should be, and just calling it extremism regardless. That's why liberals will deride both the far right and the left as being quote unquote populist, regardless of the fact that they have completely different policy prescriptions. The far right are far more extreme in this country than anyone on the left is, or at least anyone who's prominent on the left at the very least. I'm sure there are plenty of nut bars around. And then that means liberals can say, well, actually, they are far left, so I don't have to consider their opinions because if they're far left, then they must be similar to the far right because these people believe in horseshoe theory. Therefore, there can be some kind of link between fascism and leftism, which is again, it's just peak liberal brain rot. And even then, no one on the left in this country has proposed anything other than liberal social democracy, right? Nothing that was in the Corbyn manifesto you could even call socialist, apart from maybe the Inclusive Ownership Fund, for example, because that did involve some amount of the Inclusive Ownership Fund did violate property rights in the way that a lot of people who were liberals would disagree with, such that they were essentially taking shares away from people to give them to workers. That's the only socialist policy that was being given by the Labour manifesto in 2017 or 2019, for that matter.
Anna, it's hard to believe you ever were a Conservative listening to you.
Well, it's because the Conservative Party is barely the Conservative Party that I joined all those years ago. And as I say, with the exception of Alec, it has been high.
No, they're exactly the same party. Just because George Osborne and David Cameron were more professional when they were slaughtering thousands of people, that you voted for, you continually voted for all of these policies that they enacted that killed hundreds of thousands of people, Anna, right? Just because they were doing it in a more managerial and professional way does not make them a better or different party. They've all followed the same economic playbook for the last 40 years or whatever it is, and you follow this along just until Brexit happened. You're a charlatan, Anna, fuck off. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Say, oh, well, the Conservative Party's moved so far away from what they were a part of when I was there. Nonsense. In fact, Boris Johnson was far more left-wing in economics than you ever were when you were in government, Anna, or the people you supported when you were in government. And if you're saying, oh, well, I was just voting with the whips, tough then. Fucking should have left the party earlier. You should have opposed their ideological reign of terror on the poor before it got to the point where you decided to leave because of Brexit. I'm sorry, you can't just say now, oh, well, actually, when I was a Conservative, they were fine, because they demonstrably were not fine. In fact, the vast majority of the problems that we see now are because of the Conservative government of 2010 to 2016, and quite frankly, nothing to do with Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson, as much as I wish I could use it to skew them, because I hate both of them as well. But you can't just say, oh, well, it all just started with Boris Johnson. It optically may have started with him because he is a nasty piece of work, right? He is optically very poor because he's incredibly full of scandals and just a bad man, just not a good person, for example. But, you know, ideologically, as far as economics is concerned, right, they at least had a plan for regenerating the North, in the way that the Cameron and Osborne had the complete opposite, where they tried to destroy the North forever. And Boris Johnson tried to signal that there was somehow the end of austerity. And you know why he had to signal there was the end of austerity? Because someone else on the other side of the political spectrum was actually also promising an end to austerity. So they couldn't win on the economic field anymore, because they knew people were sick of austerity. And now we have a Labour Party who is committed to austerity as well, means the Conservatives have no problem with doing it as well, because the Overton window has been shifted by Keir Starmer capitulating to neoliberal centrism. The whole political class in this country is completely fucked. Completely fucked.
Hijacked. It's now the Brexit party. It's being hijacked by people who are ideologically driven on the.
See, it's only Brexit. It's only Brexit. It's all they care. It's all she cares about. It's like, oh, now Brexit's happened. Suddenly they're now extreme. But apparently, the merciless slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people is in no way extreme. That's all the stuff that she voted for and campaigned for, nonetheless. In my seat, no less, in Broxtowe, where I live.
Right, and it's moved away from the centre ground, which is why it doesn't deserve to be in government come the next general election. It needs to be in opposition, it needs to regroup and go back to what it used to be, which was a centrist right party, but most importantly was a party that you could trust with the economy, which was competent, honest and decent.
It was never competent on the economy. They've never fucking been competent on the economy, Anna. You're an idiot. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Gilt yields were literally were fucking the lowest that they'd been in decades and decades and decades in 2010 to 2016. We would just come out of a recession. We had a crisis of demand, just like we have now in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008. We needed additional expenditure from the supply side by the state to be able to regenerate the economy, and they did the opposite. Growth slowed. We lost our AAA credit rating. Everything got worse under the Conservative government of 2015 to 2016 because they didn't know what the fuck they were doing. They destroyed the country for ideological reasons. They were not competent. They were not centrist of any kind. They were, again, on economically far more right wing than the government that we have right now. But because her mind can only see things in the sense of populism versus liberalism, centrism versus extremism, she literally cannot see it. I think she probably thinks she did the right thing by voting through austerity. Like, at least Rory Stewart, right? As much as I disagree with him on loads of different things, at least Rory Stewart comes out and says that they made a mistake with austerity. How many Conservative ex-MPs are going to come out right now and say they made a mistake? I bet very fucking few of them. Like David Gork and all of that lot, right? Come on, tell me that you made a mistake. Tell me that you apologise to this country for the people that you killed. And the fact that we're essentially giving platforms to, what can essentially be mass murderers in the form of George Osborne, who now praised the Shadow Chancellor, no less. And they've got away scot-free with it. No one even criticises it. It's infuriating. Like, and we're at the point at which, again, because of the Labour rights ideological move towards neoliberalism, we are now at the position where any ability to hold the Cameron and Osborne government accountable for the crimes against humanity that it committed, right? That we were investigated by the United Nations for human rights abuses of the disabled because of the ideological cuts to disability provision that the government engaged in from 2015 to 2016. The United Nations, right? Human rights abuses. That shit happens in fucking countries that we invaded, right? To countries that we ransacked and left demagogues in charge of in the colonial era. That's the kind of shit that happens in those countries. And we're as well as exporting all of their precious materials, we also exported that as well. I'm just fucking done with fucking Anna Soubry. Every single Liberal who voted for David Cameron thinking they were doing the right thing and won't even admit that they did the wrong thing now. Like,
don't have those things in the Conservative Party anymore.
That was very kind of.
But can I just say, in a minority,
look, this is I backed Rishi Sunak, and I backed him because he said last summer that the greatest destroyer of all, not my words, by the way, Margaret Thatcher's words, was what? Inflation. The point that gentleman up there was made. We cannot deliver all we want for the British people. You know what Winston Churchill talked about Conservatives, he called the treasure in the heart of every man, unless you get on top of inflation. And if we don't address this, if we don't do inflation, if we don't grow the economy, if we don't get on top of debt, then you will not have the great public service of the future. Final, very briefly, right, we're in Birmingham. There will be a child born today in this great city that in 25 years' time, through no fault of her own, will knock on the door of the state and say, do you know what, I need some support. I've been booted out of my house by an abusive boyfriend or whatever. It will be no answer to her to say, do you know what, the cupboard is bare because the last generation didn't get on top of inflation.
You're a currency issue, you idiot. You literally issue the currency. There is you literally cannot have a bare cupboard. You are the government.
Party has elected two of the worst prime ministers this country has ever seen.
On top of these issues,
and Alex, you forget, and we have not forgotten what Liz Truss and what your government did to our economy. It played a major part of the crisis we are in. And before that, we had Boris Johnson, who was undoubtedly the worst prime minister this country has ever had.
I'm going to move on.
And we will not forgive.
Right, let me take... This is going to feel like a heck of a handbrake turn now, this next question. I'm going to warn you, but there are a number of you asked about this, and it has a lot of people have talked about it. Listen, it is my job to reflect what the audience wants to talk about here. So come on then, Jake Aldridge, where are you? Jake.
Has Harry's autobiography damaged the monarchy?
Has Harry's autobiography damaged the monarchy? Well, it's been everywhere, hasn't it? I mean, let's face it, and he's been on all the airwaves. Tim.
I can't think of a subject where everyone says they don't want to hear any more about it, yet everyone wants to talk about it at the same time. No, I seriously don't believe it has damaged the monarchy because, for a start, we've heard all this before. I'm old enough to remember the 90s. Remember the Annus Horribilis? There was a fire, there were several divorces.
No, but hang on, Tim, what is different about what Prince Harry has, just to be serious?
Well, what is different about what he said?
Well, what I tentatively suggest is at the heart of what he's talking about. He's talking about a lot, let's face it. He's basically saying that the royal family conspired with the press to make him and Meghan look bad.
Right.
That's a very serious allegation that he is making.
Well, look, okay, as if that's never happened, as if no one's ever briefed. Or my point
it's just that he's saying that, and that is the first
question is the monarchy itself damaged? And my point is, you look back over its history, brothers have been at each other's throats, the media's been involved, we've had all this before, and it has survived. In a better age, Harry and William would have resolved this with pistols at dawn, but sadly now it's done through Netflix. But the monarchy survives because its strength, its significance does not rest on the individuals within it, but upon its constitutional role. It's its constitutional stability that it provides. That's why it has lasted despite having bad people with
what constitutional stability?
In it. The person who I think with each revelation who comes out worse out of this, I'm afraid to say, is Harry himself. And the lesson that one takes from this is why so many of us appreciated Elizabeth II. And we might not have realised it at the time, but Elizabeth II never got on your nerves. Because she kept herself, she kept her opinions to herself.
That's setting the bar quite low,
I mean, she got on my nerves by fucking existing. She got on my nerves by being a monarch. So I mean, I guess that's a particular political position I hold as a Republican. But
it's not. Imagine, can you do that? And especially in the age of social media, to keep your opinions to yourself, to never put a foot wrong, to be always right and honourable and fair and even-handed. That woman was a remarkable demonstration of the power of silence and just getting on with it.
Okay. So, the question is, has Harry's autobiography and everything that's gone on this last week and a half damaged the monarchy? I mean, it's interesting what you say to him about, the monarchy survives because the monarchy itself is more important than an individual within it. And, of course, Harry's making the point that he's been the sacrificial lamb, in a way, for the institution.
Well, I think the people who come out worst from the autobiography are the press, quite frankly, because what the autobiography lifts a lid on is the very grubby dealings between the institution of the palace and the tabloid media, where instead of being able to be a family, which is defined by love and nurturing and caring for one another, the royals have been turned into this kind of hideous cartel where they're feeding each other to the wolves in order to advance their own interests. And I recognise this as a minority opinion in this country, but I do think that that is a quality inherent to monarchy. I think that princes and dukes are good names for musicians and dogs. I don't think that they're, great titles for human beings. And when you look at the misery that these people have inflicted on one another, I think of them as, like zoo animals who've been, bred in captivity, and they lead these existences where they're clearly really unhappy, but we go, oh, isn't it so good for tourism?
Hang on. Okay.
And she's absolutely 100% correct that the people who do come out words are the press, because the press in this country are absolute fucking vultures. They are the worst kind of people that you would not want to shake hands with unless somehow any of their parts of their personality were in some way catching, right? If you realise that being a tabloid media fuckhead was in some way was so virulent that you could catch it from some of them, you would never want to touch one of these arseholes in your life, right? You'd never want to come near them lest you become one of them, right? Because these people are just like the absolute worst people in the country. There is no one who is lower than a tabloid journalist. And again, I would highly recommend you watching both of Mooncat's videos around Meghan Markle and the royal family that discusses the relationship between the tabloid media and the royal family. It's called The Royal Rota. It's really important. It's really worth watching her video. She goes into a really deep dive about it. And essentially, it's the royal family exists to sell newspapers. Like, the tourism argument is completely bunk because people would still visit the palaces regardless of whether they have people in them or not. That's, like, people still visit all of the palaces in France despite the fact that they got all choppy with their monarchs 300 years ago. But what they really do is they exist to sell a brand. They exist to be able to be a constant soap opera for the press to be able to use to continually to sell papers. And that's why Meghan and Harry have to be demonised by the press. They have to be demonised because their decision to step away from royal duties and to essentially give them less fresh meat for them to chew on as the pro-monarchy tabloid, they have to be destroyed lest they take away their revenue source, right? There's an unwritten rule, as Harry points out in his book as well, that there should be no complaints by the royal family about the media on the assumption that media will treat them in a certain specific way. And Harry said, I'm going to take that rule, right? I'm going to take that unwritten rule, I'm going to put it in the bin, because I would like to lead a normal life as a normal human being. And quite frankly, I applaud him for that. I mean, I may also just applaud Harry because he makes monarchists angry, and that's something that I just like, kind of on a Schadenfreude type basis, just like watching monarchists, or monarch cucks, because that's what they really are. They are just cucks to an incredibly wealthy family that they really didn't need to be. As they absolutely get fucking seething mad over Harry and Meghan, I find it incredibly funny and incredibly cathartic. But yeah, the absolute tabloid press are vultures. They are the absolute worst people, and you would never want to ever be friends with any of them. I wouldn't recommend it.
No, seriously. He never actually gives any examples of that whatsoever.
He does give examples. He gives the example of private conversations between, oh God, I can't believe I know this. I feel like I know too much about these people and it's driving me insane. But he gives examples of private conversations with Camilla and his brother, which made it to the press.
No, but he doesn't, you see.
He gives other examples of negative briefing against, him and Meghan. Now, I'm not taking sides because I'm a Republican. I've got integrity. I can't stand any of them. But I do think it lifts the lid on press practices. And one of the things you can tell about where power is truly wielded in this country is the fact that we were supposed to have Leveson Part 2 looking at press practices, how they collaborate with the police. And I got kicked into the long grass because no politician wants to get on the wrong side of Rupert Murdoch.
Let's hear a bit from our audience. Sister guys, you're waving your hand frantically there. Yes, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I've got a lot of respect for Elizabeth II as well. But what does it say about the purpose of the royal family if the best thing we're saying they should be doing is to be silent?
Because they fill a constitutional role. It's not about themselves as an individual.
All right, let me hear some. There's a man here at the front. We'll get a microphone to you in the striped shirt.
I think what we've got here is an example of hypocritical privilege. He's been happy to accept everything that comes with his role right the way through his life. He's criticised the media and said, I don't want anything to do with them, and now he's using them at his will to make money. I'm sorry, but that is just as low as it gets.
But if he's stepping away from his royal role, then he's stepping away from the ability to be able to gain revenue from being a royal, right? And if anything, quite frankly, if you're going to be if I'm going to be all fucking right-wing about this shit, right, I would much rather him make his money from creating a product that he can then sell on the marketplace, right? Rather than the rest of his family were all scrounging off government handouts, right? Living off, the bank of the state, right? I hate to be all fucking conservative about this, right? But I have far more respect for somebody who gets up and makes their own living than lives off of state handouts. And not the state handouts that people think about when they think about state handouts, which is the absolute fucking pitiful amount the people on the bottom rung of the ladder in this country do pay, because unemployment is necessary without a federal jobs guarantee. But that's another long conversation to have about welfare. But the gigantic amounts of obscene welfare that the state has to pay out to keep this incredibly expensive family in Rolexes and crowns and diamonds and priceless artifacts and palaces. Like, I'm sorry, like, if he wants to make some amount of money, probably pretty substantial now considering how fast the book has sold, doing interviews, being on Netflix, writing a book, more power to the guy, right? You go enjoy yourself, you fill your boots, right? As long as you're not taking money from the state, go ahead. Don't really care. But the important thing about it is people actually make this comparison a lot with Prince Harry, where they will say, well, actually, while he said they didn't want to have any interactions with the press, but now he's having interviews with the press. And like, yeah, but he's having interviews on his own terms, right? The actual interviews that he's having is where he gets to discuss his issues on his terms, rather than everything being leaks or paparazzi snaps or dirty stories or, all these bits of kind of soap opera drama type stuff that has been part of the royal family discussion about it for years. He saw it happen to his mum and he didn't want it to happen to him, so he stepped away. It's as simple as that, right? He has been far more affected by his mum's death, and I think you'll find, I think that he goes into pretty bit of detail in that in the book, not that I read it. And he understands that part of the reason why his mum's dead is because the press are the worst people in this country. It's as simple as that. And he saw that and went, no, screw that. Not going to bother.
Okay. Does anyone here want to put in a good word for Harry? Does anyone here feel actually what he's done is... There must be someone here, yes. But done the right thing. Yes, the woman there actually, the woman on the end in the black, yeah.
I think Harry has done his best to address some personal struggles, and when I watched the interview with ITV, sat down, and he was quite candid. I think, what kind of country are we going to be if you can't even express freely, how you feel, what you're going through? Now, what we have to also acknowledge is, yes, he may be making money, but he is doing things that he is enjoying. And I think one thing that I personally like to address as a black woman is that a lot of people negatively in the press have been blaming Meghan. We saw the very, very derogatory words by Clarkson, Jeremy Clarkson, talking about how he wants to, I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm sure you're all familiar with it, talking about how he wants to see Meghan run through the streets and have, basically poo thrown at her. And that, again, is an example of where, when we begin to blur the lines, we then see problems. I think what we have to also acknowledge is Harry is, even before Meghan came along, he felt disenfranchised, he felt left out. As Ash said, he gave the examples of where he felt like he was being fed to the dogs. And so I don't think it's fitting to say, he's made his money, let's just, he's ruining this, and it is a monarchy damage. But there has to be a point, just with anything, whether it be strikes or whether it be any other political thing. As a politics student, there has to be, what I've realised, there has to be an opportunity for people to say, this is what I believe, I'm going to air that. And so even, things like racism, because racism is prevalent in the press and it needs to be addressed.
Okay. Bridget.
I think it's terribly sad to see any family in conflict or where there's that kind of dispute, and I think it's even sadder when that's played out in public. The royal family stay out of politics.
Is it damaging the monarchy? That's the thing.
No, I don't think it is. But the royal family stay out of politics, and I think it's right that politicians don't involve themselves in the private family matters of the royal family. I think it's terribly sad what's happened, but I don't think it's really for politicians to involve ourselves in any big way in that decision.
Is it damaging the monarchy?
No, it's not. And I think the only thing I would add, because Bridget's absolutely right, politicians don't get involved. The only thing, as we were talking about Queen Elizabeth II, I remember when she went to Ireland, that famous trip in 2011, and she was talking, of course, about reconciliation. And she gave this expression, which just occurred to me now, really resonated with me, where she said that if you want to reconcile, it's incumbent on everyone to think about how they might have done things differently or not at all. And it was a very, very powerful expression. And I just hope that relations do improve over time, because I think they've all made a contribution to their country. And families are difficult. Of course they're difficult. But I think in the interest of that family, in the interest of the country, I do hope they reconcile.
I think it is, like Bridget said, I think it's really, really sad. And I was always a big fan of Prince Harry and indeed Meghan Markle. I thought it was a wonderful thing when they got married.
So when he says, so the criticisms he's made, for example, you know, you refer to the Queen Consort, Camilla, as dangerous due to her need to change her villain
No,
image.
I think he said she was seen as being dangerous.
Okay.
He never said she was.
With the family built on hierarchy and Camilla on the way to being Queen Consort, there was going to be people or bodies left in the street because of that. I mean, do you think this stuff is damaging?
I think it's damaging to Harry.
Right.
I don't think it will damage the monarchy for the reasons that Tim and others have said. But I think a lot of what he said would have been better left between him and his psychotherapist, frankly. And not, I mean, I really don't want to know, no disrespect, I don't want to know about how anybody lost their virginity. Never mind
some... We're going to talk about that afterwards.
That's going to be the topic of conversation in the green room, wasn't it?
That would be between you and I. But I mean, in all seriousness, look, what happened to him, like any 12-year-old, to lose your mother, but particularly in those circumstances, was appalling. And I'm sure that lots of terrible mistakes were made. But I think one of my criticisms of this is that he doesn't actually have any solutions to it at all. He doesn't have anything positive to say, look, this is how perhaps we could do things better. And
in fact, perversely, he wants to come back. So,
he
called the family hierarchical. It's a monarchy.
Okay.
Hello? Of course it's hierarchical. And this is the strange thing about Harry. He attacks the individuals within the institution, but when asked, do you still support the monarchy? I do. And now, from the point of view of a Republican, isn't that a little bit mad?
Well, I think he should give up his titles, and that's the thing which leaves me very cold, is that I think that Meghan and Harry have been treated abominably by the institution. I think they've been treated abominably by the press. But please spare me the words from a duke and a duchess about equality when their complaint is that they've not been treated well by an inherently unequal institution.
Let's not spend any longer talking about that subject, simply because so much has been said about it the last week and a half. Well, no, but he's made... Listen, the airways have been full of it, so it's not that people haven't want to talk about it, and you want to talk about it here.
I mean, I wish I was in the audience just so I could make my line about benefit scroungers and just call out all of the Conservatives here saying they are happy, that they think it's good that we have a family of people who essentially live off of state benefits, and again, estate benefits which include a fucking palace. A palace which they took hardship funds from the government to be able to refurbish.
We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. I just want to get this question in from Anna. Anna, perfect. Where are you? There you go, Anna.
Students currently study maths to 16. Rishi Sunak wants to increase this to 18. What difference will 4 years make?
I have to say, when I saw that question come in, I laughed like a drain. Very nicely and ironically put. And you're a teacher, I think, Anna, is that right? Yes, so obviously the joke is there. OK. Study maths to 18. Alex, the idea is for everyone to do A-level? Or?
No, absolutely not.
What is it then?
No, of course it's not for everyone to do A-level. What the Prime Minister is saying, and he's absolutely right, is that as you compare... No, he is. Look, he's absolutely right. If you compare...
We have to be quite brief, actually. We've got 3 minutes left.
Sorry, fine. But if you compare this country to peer nations, typically they do tend to do maths till later. Now, of course, not everyone is going to do A-level. That's right. But when it comes to financial education, so that people can be more empowered when they're dealing with issues of credit or mortgages or rent or compounding, these sorts of principles are things that are going to assist our young people. Final point, of course, we are in a global competition. We're in a global competition with nations like India, like
You don't need maths, you need financial literacy. Like, I'm pretty sure the ability to do percentages and do compound interest is already included in your GCSE maths. I know the compound interest was included in my GCSE maths, right? I'm pretty sure, as I've said many times when discussing this issue, that having to deal with complex integration or vector calculus or engage or do binomial expansions or whatever is not particularly relevant to most people.
China, over half of the world's economy is now in the Eastern Hemisphere. We've got to ensure that this country is match fit to win the jobs of tomorrow. And maths is important.
I love maths. I have multiple A-levels in maths, right? I did an extra A-level in maths by choice. Do I think that everyone should be forced to study it till 18? No.
We'll have to be quite brief, forgive me.
It's a meaningless pledge from the Prime Minister. We don't have enough maths teachers already to teach the children that we currently have, and year-on-year recruitment targets are met for our maths teachers, and some of the same challenges that we see in our NHS, we see in our schools. I think it's really important that children get a strong foundation in all of the basics, and I believe in high standards in all of our schools. That's why we've said that Labour would end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, and we would put that £1.7 billion into brilliant state education for every child in our country.
You have to be very quick. Tim.
Labour has said it might ban smoking, and the Tories want us to do double maths. I don't know who I'm supposed to vote for at the next election. If I was forced to do maths, I would have dropped out of school rather than do it. I hate it. I was terrible at it. And if anyone can't count by the age of 16, why on earth do you imagine that forcing them to do 2 more years of it at a higher level is going to make them any better at it? It's so stupid.
I agree with Tim yet again, but I would say this. I think for your first speech to the nation, to say that your big vision for the future of our country is that we should all be doing maths in 4 years' time until we're 18, says a lot about the state of this government. It doesn't have a vision. And we need now to have a leader of our country who is competent, decent, but also has a vision for our future.
Doesn't have a vision at all.
Well, it helps that literally none of the parties have any vision whatsoever, apart from maybe the SNP.
And the Tories got no plan. I'm so sorry.
I mean, like, talking about counting of those 5 pledges, I think 2 or 3 of them were going to happen anyway, so that is cheating.
Yes, that's true.
When it comes to maths lessons, when it comes to maths lessons, I actually don't think it's a bad idea. And first and foremost, I think that those maths lessons should be given to
agreeing with the government now?
I don't think it's a bad idea. I think maybe I'd have, retained a bit of long division had I done it to 18 rather than dropping it at 16. But I think that first in line for those maths lessons should be the MPs of your own party who crashed the economy into the wall in order to be a tax cut to the rich.
Let's give a laugh. We've got about 20 seconds, Anna. Let's hear from you.
I was about to say the same thing. I agree with Bridget. There's not enough maths teachers as there is, but perhaps Chancellor Kwarteng and Prime Minister Truss could have done with a calculator in the summer, and that might have avoided some of the other issues.
Okay. Right. Well, if we can count, our 60 minutes are up. Thank you very much.
I did say when we were watching Rishi Sunak's speech, I did say, right, that it's going to be a real fucking, double-edged sword if they teach all these kids maths and statistics, and they're like, oh, so the government are really bad, and I know that, and I can prove it with actual facts and statistics, which it seems like a bad thing for them to do to themselves, but nevertheless, Ash, incredibly based as always throughout the entire panel. We just have all the same opinions. She's just really good. And she was pretty based, and everyone else on the panel irritated me a great deal, especially Anna Soubry. I actually got more mad at Anna Soubry than I did at the Telegraph columnist or the actual Conservative MP, just because, actually, just like a lot of humans, like I tend to be more irritated by hypocrisy than I really should be. Rather than the actual, as a utilitarian, I should just care about the utility of what they're espousing right now. But something about the hypocrisy of Anna Soubry just really grates on my nerves. It really does.